Okay, I'm going to talk about my book. And thank you all. Thank you so much for coming to this. I've been overwhelmed in all sorts of ways, both in the kind of with pleasure and with terror, overwhelmed by the number of people who've been signing up over these last few weeks. So whilst I was waffling, I was welcoming old friends, and I've got some friends on here with whom I go back an awful long way. So I'm welcoming them. I'm welcoming family, got various family members. I've also got people sending me messages saying, Jane and I can't get in, the email isn't working. So I don't know what I can do about them. Can I just ask my technical person, shall I just carry on, Soph? You deal with them? I will do. So we've got family members. We've also got some people stranded in cyberspace, and we'll have to just do what we can with them. There are also people who I don't know, including people trying to join us from the States. So I hope you get through and join us. But let me just thank you all for coming once again. Now then, I want to say some special thanks. I want to say thank you to people in my writing group. So there's Paul and Francis and Angela and Gaynor, and I think they're with us or trying to join us tonight. This is a group of people who I've been writing with or exchanging my writing and reading their writing for over a decade now. And the book that I'm talking about tonight and the other things that I've written in the past decade owe a great deal to their critical insights. And we've been looking at each other's writing, as I say, on a very regular basis. So hello to you and thank you. Equally, I'm in a reading group and have been in this same reading group now for 20 years. This is a reading group based in Nottingham. And we've been reading books together and talking about books for 20 years. I know some of you on here, and some of you I don't know, I suspect, are in reading groups. Well, I've learned so much from these other readers. They're intelligent and sensitive readers, and they've helped me understand how to read. And of course, knowing how to read also helps you know how to write. I particularly want to say thank you to Bill and Valley for the cover of my book, and I'll say a tiny bit about that. Bill Bevan, my friend and neighbour 2 doors up, has designed this cover, and so he's responsible for the colours, the arrangement, and the font. And I know he investigated this font, and I think this is called Perpetua, and it was devised way back in the 1920s. So some of the book is set in the 1920s, so the cover is very sympathetic to the font, and the font is sympathetic to the content. And finally, I just want to say thank you to Sophia again, who's sorting out all this technical jumble, and looks like we're getting there and people are coming through. Is that right, Sophia? We're getting there? Yeah, jolly good. Okay, so next slide, please. Never a Word grew out of this book, The Naples of England, that I published in 2015. And it's a memoir. And I know that some of you on here have read this memoir. And it's basically about growing up in the seaside town of Weymouth in Dorset, mainly in the 1950s. And the bulk of the book is about that. And then at the very end, I described a situation that happened to me, which was that in a casual conversation with my mother, it emerged, when I was 35 years old, it emerged that my dad's mother had killed herself, had thrown herself into the sea. And I wrote The Naples of England, talking about a kind of sense of a secure upbringing in a secure place at a relatively secure time, the 1950s, and in a secure family. And I was just staggered by the idea that underneath that security was this great secret that has somehow stayed buried, and I got no inkling of. Even though we talked about our family quite frequently, and my mum talked about her relations quite often, I was quite an inquisitive kid. I couldn't understand how I'd got to 35 and had no inkling of this and how it had slipped out. So a lot of people came back to me on this book, and some people said that they discovered similar things in their own families, quite by surprise when they were adults. So next slide, please, Soph. Some people said, well, we've read your book, Andy. what happened next? And I thought, well, that's quite a good question, what happened next? And the answer is I just could have carried on with my life, really. But a better question, I thought, was what could have happened next, or what might happen next? And this encouraged me to think about writing fiction rather than carrying on with memoir. I'd done the memoir bit from my childhood. And I thought also writing fiction will allow me to free up what I'm writing about. So I decided that I was going to use that event, somebody in their 30s, finding out some shocking secret from their family, and then seeing what to do next. So could we have the next slide, please? So this is a quote from P.D. James. This sort of thing is often said. She says here, all fiction is largely autobiographical, and much autobiography is, of course, fiction. I mean, maybe the all and the much are overstating the case, but listening to various fiction writers, and one soon gets the idea, soon picks up the notion that fiction isn't totally fiction, that people are always drawing bits of themselves and their own lives, their family, their friends, things they've seen on the television, things they've read in books, seen in films. Works of fiction are often a mishmash of all sorts of real and invented and transposed things. So I, in this book, in this fictional account, I'm drawing on bits of my own life and my own family, but I'm also drawing on bits of friends' lives, bits and pieces that I've picked up, as I say, in books, films, whatever. And every now and then, just occasionally, bits of imagination. I heard Ian Rankin speak once, and in question time, somebody said, you must have a very good imagination to write all these D.I. Rebus novels. And he answered in very, very colourful language, which I shan't repeat, basically saying he had no imagination. Everything was cobbled together from stories that people had told him and from his own observations of what was going on. So this, the book I'm going to talk about tonight, this Never a Word, is a work of fiction. There's bits of me explicitly in it, and then there's bits of me that aren't me. So I'm going to talk about it as fiction now and not as autobiography, although I will lapse, well, just the once anyway, as I go along, maybe more than once. So next slide, please, Soph. A lot of the book is set in South Dorset, this little bit of South Dorset. This is an old map, that's why it's torn and weathered, a 1920s map. This is the town that I grew up in, Weymouth. Some of you will know it, some of you live there if you've managed to get on. Well, I know Sue's on, and many of you will have visited it, but some of you may not know it at all. So very briefly, on the right-hand side, you can see this lovely curving bay, Weymouth Bay. And it was a great place to be a child. It was big sands, shelving sea, safe to swim in, amusement arcades, ice cream stalls, donkey rides. What more do you want? Down the bottom here is this island, well, it's a peninsula just joined, of Portland. And that's a rugged, wild place with wild seas around it. And then on the left-hand side, we've got West Bay. And West Bay is a big stretch of water. And it can be quite ferocious. I remember as a child standing on that beach and looking at it and being absolutely terrified by it. And although I'm a bit of a wild swimmer and I've swum in lots of places in the world now, I've never been off that beach. And I do wonder whether I'm ever going to go off Chesil Beach before I die, or in fact, whether I might go off Chesil Beach and die. I've never quite had the nerve to go in there. And if you've read Moonfleet, J. Mead Faulkner's Moonfleet, which we read at school, there's an incredibly graphic description of the pirate whose ship gets wrecked in West Bay, and Jim Trenchard's trying to pull him onto land with a rope, and he can't make it out because of the undertow. And I remember standing there as a child with my dad, and my dad saying to me, you don't want to go in there because if you go in, you can't get out because of the undertow. So what I'm saying really is on the right-hand side, we've got this family beach, which is lovely, warm, golden. And on the left-hand side, we've got this wild, dangerous, big stretch of sea, West Bay. And that line of, that strange line with water on either side of it, all across the left-hand diagonal, that's Chesil Beach. People who've been there will definitely have seen Chesil Beach. But if you haven't been there, what a strange geographical structure that was. Across the top of this map, almost going across the top, just curving slightly, there's a ring of hills called the Ridgeway. And I always thought this was a fascinating place to grow up, and spent a long time looking at this map. To me, this was a world in itself. I seldom went outside this picture in my childhood. I reckon, I'm trying to guess, I reckon before I was 16, I left that bit of map about 12 times. I may be wrong, but, and it always seemed to me like a world that you could write stories in and live in and create in. And it seemed cut off from the rest of England. However, so that's where a lot of this book is set, but not all of it. So on to the book. Next slide, please, Soph. These are the characters who feature in the book. So as you can see, there's 5 generations here. I'm mainly not going to be talking about the ones at the top, George and Ivy, and I'm mainly not going to be talking about the ones at the bottom, Callum and Grace. Next slide, please. The main character, there are 2 main characters there are 2 people whose stories we follow in this book, and one of them is Sue Roberts. She was born in 1948, so she's kind of my generation, and she's born and brought up in Weymouth, and with her sister Janet, and half of the book tells her story. Next slide, please, Soph. The other half of the book tells the story of Letitia, who was born in 1890. She's actually born over the border in Somerset, and one half of the book will be Letitia's story. I was interested in doing this because I don't know really why I wanted to do this, but it seemed like quite a challenge and quite an interesting thing to do. I thought by telling Sue's story and by telling Letitia's story, if you like, following them through their lives or through their time, I could vicariously tell the story of Sue's parents, Les and Avril. Les is sometimes called Clary. So next slide, please, Soph. So although we don't follow Les and Avril's story chronologically, step by step, we follow these other 2 characters in yellow, we are indirectly, I think, telling their story as well. And I quite like the idea of that sandwich, really, of those 2 in the green there, having their story told by the generation on either side of them. Okay, so next slide, please, Soph. These are the chapters in the book, and I'll say a bit more about, we'll come back to this slide as we go along. But what I'm going to do to kick us off is read a short bit from chapter 1. And chapter 1 is, if you've read The Naples of England, I know some of you have, if you've read that, chapter 1 is almost a verbatim copy, give or take a bit, from the last chapter in The Naples of England, only this time it has been set in Sue's family. So it's quite deliberate and explicit, that transition from memoir into fiction. So I'm just going to read you a little bit, and I'm going to stand up to this so I can present better. Read you a little bit from chapter 1. Now this is set in the early 1980s. Sue is 35, and she's talking with her mother. They're in Ilkley, which is where Sue and Giles, her husband, and their 2 children live in Yorkshire. And Les and Avril are visiting them over Christmas, and they're having a conversation, Sue and Avril, as they wash up after Boxing Day tea. Okay. I never knew Dad's mum, did I? Asked Sue. I've always assumed she died before I was born. Oh, your Dad's mother died a long, long time before you were born. I knew Granny Roberts wasn't Dad's mother, But I don't seem to know anything about his real mum, said Sue. When did she die? Avril held up the dinner plate she was drying and stared hard into its empty face. Oh, it was years ago. Our dad was only a little boy. He never talks about it. Gosh, I hadn't even realised in all these years. Well, you wouldn't. He never talks about it, your dad. So what did he die of? Asked Sue, as she too stopped her slow, circular drying. Her mother stiffened and stared down more intently. She'd done herself in the sea, off the Nothe, I think. The Nothe Fort, where Sue had scrabbled as a child along the thin, sunless strip of rock exposed at low tide, lifting black, smelly strands of weed in search of a mouthful of winkles to take home to boil for tea. Avril turned her head away towards the table, still holding the plate. Granny Roberts had to somehow become a less established figure for Sue, who was still struggling to fit another woman, faceless and nondescript, into parts of her dominion. Somebody in a cart-wheeling trajectory against the sky, propelled from the top of the fortification onto the rocks. So much of it couldn't be right. Sue could not be learning about such happenings for the very first time at 35 years of age. She struggled to find any words to say. This violent, dramatic death was out of kilter with her whole sense of the past. But there was no time for any further questions. Callum had bounded into the room, full of restless enthusiasm, followed by Giles carrying Grace. Is it still switched on, he said, pointing to the new computer. Come on, Grandma, we're all going to play. Our dad says I shouldn't have told you. I mustn't say anything else. Avril came straight out with it the following evening, as soon as Sue had managed to engineer some time alone with her in the kitchen and to raise the matter again. Okay. Next slide, please, Sue. Please, Sue. Sophie. Okay, so this is just a background slide. I do like it very much. Valley Miller drew this, and I just love the sense of volumes in that water and the isolation of that figure. So, and the kind of black and white, I don't know if it's almost impressionist really feel to it. It's lovely. So next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, so some questions arrive from this first chapter, and the ones that kind of go through the book a bit are Sue's wondering how has her parents kept this shocking secret from her? Why have they done it, and how do they manage to do it? How was, second question, what blunted Sue's own curiosity so effectively and for so long? However, could she have gone through what she felt was a normal upbringing with this hanging in the background and have had no inkling of it? So these questions will recur as we go through Sue's story through the book. But if we go back to the chapter, next slide, please. Just back to the chapters. We're now going to go to chapter 2, which is the Children of the May. And here we begin Letitia's story. We don't at this stage know that Letitia is Sue's grandmother, but I'm not giving too much away to say that she does discover this about halfway through the book. But we follow Letitia's story for a while, and I'll read you a little bit of that just to give you the feel. But before I do that, I'll say something about the chapter structure here. Chapter 1, which we've just heard a tiny bit from, is Sue's story. Chapter 2, which we're going to do now, Letitia's story. Then we go back to Sue for chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we deal with Sue's adolescence and early adulthood. By 7, we're back with Letitia. 7, 8, 9, 10 is Letitia's life, and chapter 10, a wartime wedding. We're in the First World War now. Then for chapter 11, we go back to Sue, And as we get nearer the end, the chapters are alternating more quickly between Sue and Letitia. And right down near the end, the last chapters, within the chapter, the paragraphs are starting to alternate between the two. So there's a real kind of coming together. And as I said a bit earlier on, in a sense, that middle generation is being squeezed in the sandwich between these two stories. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to read you a little bit now about Letitia. The children, they're quite tiny, Letitia and her sister Maud, and they're playing a game with Bertie, who's very tiny. He's about 2, and the girls are kind of 5 and 7, that sort of age. Maud is the elder. So here they go. Maud and Letitia fussed around him as he began. Oh, yes, sorry. Bertie has just started to cry and he doesn't want to play the game. He's normally dead keen, but there's something wrong. Okay. Maud and Letitia fussed around him as he began to pull at the long strip of cloth that they'd wrapped around his head and fashioned into a turban. They complained that his participation was central if they were to fulfill their destinies as shipwrecked sailor and slave girl. But Bertram ignored their injunctions and continued to tug half-heartedly at his disintegrating headgear. He lowered himself onto the flagstone floor of the living room. His tears were obscured by the dishevelled material falling into his face. The girls heard him begin to cry softly and recognized his genuine distress. Maud pulling away the trailing remnants of the turban, while Letitia knelt in front of him, her hands on his small, bony shoulders. Bertie, don't cry. You can be the sailor. We can play another game if you want. What's wrong? Bertram, pale face and completely miserable, looked up, trying to answer his sister. Instead, his face showed an emptiness of expression, an absence of any of the joy with which he usually attempted to follow his sister's demands and directions. Maud assumed the nurturing demeanour she sometimes employed with her younger brother and sister and felt Bertram's forehead. Let me feel him, urged Letitia, as Bertram flopped against Maud's shoulder. No, fetch Mama. He's unwell. We can't have you fussing around him. Is he cooking up? Asked Letitia. No, he isn't. Will you just fetch Mother, please? Ivy, their mother, hurried in from the scullery at the sound of the girls' raised voices. Mama, he's just started crying. He didn't want to be the Sultan and he started... Bertie, darling, what's... Hurts, he said, looking up at his mother. What hurts, Bertie? Where does it hurt, darling? Yes, where? Insisted Letitia, shaking his shoulders. Okay, so that's just an introduction to these 3 children. Bertram's condition deteriorates considerably, and they worry about sending for the doctor and whether they can afford to pay for the doctor, but that's sorted out, and he arrives on his horse and immediately says the 2 small children mustn't be in the house, and they are sent to go and stay with their Aunt Lily overnight. And they come back the next day with Lily, and Lily tells the children they must wait outside, they mustn't come in the cottage, while she goes in to just see whether she can be of any help. However, Letitia, who's quite strong-minded, has left her doll, Miss Raggedy, in the house, and she's determined to go and get the doll. I want Miss Raggedy, said Letitia. You mustn't, said Maud. You'll get skinned alive. But Letitia was beyond threats. Miss Raggedy had been abandoned in the house. Letitia, you mustn't, said Maud, again to her determined younger sister. I can't, I won't, I'm not going to look. I'm going to look up here instead. And Maud turned to face the path and the culvert. Letitia found again the inconspicuous space at the head of the stairs, low down outside the partially open door, but with a view of most of the interior. Bertram was sleeping, a very slight rise and fall of the bedding across his chest, regular and rhythmical and just discernible. The drawn curtains lent an even greater gloom to the corners of the room. An oil lamp was burning on a small round bedside table, illuminating Ivy as she knelt at Bertram's side. She was wearing the same long black skirt and apron as when the girls had left the afternoon before. Only now these looked too big for her, as if her body had somehow become shrunken by the slow passage of the long night she had surely spent at Bertram's bedside. Lily was standing back from the bed, a sprig of dried shrubs hanging from the ceiling rafters above her and casting a flickering forest of shadows on the wall. Next to them, also with hands clasped in prayer, and at the very foot of the bed, knelt Father Reeves. Father Reeves in his black robes, not in full voice in the church pulpit, but in their house. Not beside mourners in his graveyard, but in their house, upstairs. Not hurrying across the lawn between his church and the vicarage, but in their house, upstairs, in the private cloisters of their bedroom. Not striking out against sin, not receiving the tiny children of the May, but knelt in silent prayer beside their mother in their house, upstairs in their bedroom. As a result of this incident, Bertram does get better and survives, although it had been a very serious illness. And as a result of what she's witnessed, Letitia forms a lifelong belief in the almost godlike powers of clergymen. And because of what she's witnessed as a small child and seen, and she puts Bertram's recovery down to Father Reeves' visit and his prayers. And this is unfortunate, really, because later in her life, Letitia's life, this doesn't help her having this godlike belief in clergy. But we won't. I'm going to say we'll come to it, but we won't come to it. One of the problems I've had with selections, I'll just do a quick aside, is I sat down and read the end of the book yesterday again. And I thought, oh, I'd like to read some of this. I like these bits. But of course, I can't read the end of the book because it would spoil the story. So I'm having to read you bits from the beginning and from the middle so that I don't introduce any spoilers. So I won't say anything more about Letitia and clergymen. But we will have a look at the next slide, please. Okay, so just going back to Sue, she had those questions that we looked at earlier. There's some more questions that now arise for Sue. She's not happy about the idea of this grandmother not being known about. And she has a moral dilemma, which is, does she have the right to find out more about her grandmother if this might reawaken an unbearable hurt for her father? She's got the impression that her father will never talk about his mother, and she's torn between not hurting him and torn between feeling that somehow she has to stand up for or certainly not allow this grandmother to just disappear from history. And then she wonders, second question, is she really just indulging herself in the melodrama of her grandmother's death? And finally, at the back of her mind, is the worry that if she pushes too hard on this dilemma and gets it wrong and tries to pursue knowledge about her grandmother, is she going to cause big problems for herself and her family? So these are the kind of dilemmas that she's wrestling with. Next slide, please. Okay, back to the chapters. So we've looked at a bit of chapter 1 and a bit of chapter 2. I'm going to race right on now to chapter 11, 3 photographs. So we've had a good chunk of both Sue's and Letitia's life by this stage. And when we get to 3 photographs, we're up to the early 1990s. And Les, her father, has died by this stage, and he's been dead for a couple of years. And the next bit we're going to look at is a bit that is autobiographical. I used an event which happened to me as the basis for something I've written about Sue. So I'll just read you a little bit from chapter 11. Sue is sitting in her mother's garden with her mother. Her mother has moved to Portsmouth. Sue's parents moved to Portsmouth and away from Weymouth with her dad's job, but after she'd left home and was married and living away. So Avril now lives in Portsmouth, and they're sitting in the garden. Yes, and I say it's been a couple of years since Les has died, and just find the right place. Oh, here we are. Right. What do you think about this then, said Avril, tossing a weathered brown envelope into Sue's lap as they sat out on an early summer's day in Avril's garden. What are these? Sue asked, as she looked inside and found 3 old photographs. It's her. Who? Your dad's mother, it's her. It was 2.5 years since Les's death, and Avril's distressed insistence that there should be no funeral. And now these photographs had appeared. These are who? Sue asked again as she stared at the photographs. Your dad's mother. The first photograph, a young woman posed anxiously before the camera, head and shoulders with a slight sepia halo, a hazy background. Next slide, please, Sue. Her top teeth just visible. Dark hair centrally parted and gathered at the level of her ears. Large eyes staring straight ahead. Prominent cheekbones, a heavy pendant on a fine chain around her neck, a white and pale coloured blouse with a soft collar. Sue found it hard to place her age, the formality of the photograph probably adding years. No older than 20, perhaps as young as 17. A beautiful young woman. That face, though, Sue had seen it before. The eyes, the bridge of the nose, the mouth slightly open, as if in some unvoiced plea. Do something, she seemed to be imploring. Sue knew it so well. Next slide, please, Sue. She knew it from the old primary school photograph of herself. Next slide, please. Here we are talking about her again, and now that I've got a face, I realise that I don't even know her name. What was she called? I don't know. Your dad would never discuss her. I know you said he didn't like to talk about her, but I mean, when the subject of parents came up, did you ever? He never talked about her. Do you mean he never mentioned her? You were married for the best part of, 50 years? Sometimes you must have talked about your parents. I did, yes, but he would never, ever mention her. Not even her name or anything, her existence. He never talked about her. Didn't you ask him? Oh, no, he wouldn't have wanted me to do that. Sue asked whether she could keep the photographs, anxious that they should not disappear back into the silence. Avril flicked the back of her hand towards Sue and looked away. Was this a theatrical indifference? Or was it embarrassment or even fear, masquerading as irritation? Sue said that she would make copies. She slid them back into their envelope, then folded it between the pages of the book she'd been reading. Driving home that evening through the centre of England, emotions seemed to rock the speeding car. Relief that a face had been found. Pity, more direct and uncontained than she'd ever experienced, for a woman wiped away by her own family, by Sue's own family. Excitement at a barrier trampled. Anticipation of the first few steps of a track newly discernible. Fear that events so fickle could take it all away again. Guilt at her greedy appropriation. Sue stopped at the first service station on the M1 with an intense desire to look again at the younger photo. The girl was still staring out, still strongly feminine. Sue thought that a man might see an erotic vulnerability in the set of her shoulders, or in the words she seemed on the point of speaking. This woman could have glanced across a future or slipped across a past at any time. Instead, a blank record. Others taking her place. Generations stepping forward, one wave after another. Futures to be populated. A widening fan of talent and promise. Sue felt so angry that this woman had been removed from history's huge parade, sidelined, left at night at the far end of an alleyway behind the cardboard boxes and debris. And then she was angry with herself for her lack of sympathy with the family that in desperation had taken whatever action they needed to hold themselves together after the horror of the suicide. However did they maintain their waking and sleeping routines and give an appearance of coping? How did they close themselves off from mutterings and innuendo often savoured by others in such circumstances? This photograph of the children, creased with a folded corner, had been revisited far more often than the two cleanly preserved portraits of their mother. They would have been little older in this photograph at the time. They would have been little older than in this photograph, at the time of their mother's death. They had needed to survive. Do something, the woman implored. But do what? Okay, next slide, please. You might have noticed I said that was autobiographical, and I don't want to slip between the two too much, but I couldn't resist it really. I put in a little photograph of me at primary school in the middle of that you saw briefly, just because I was, and that is the photograph of my grandmother that I'm using here for fictional purposes. She's not called Letitia. Letitia is the name of the character in the story. But I did see that photograph in the way I've described there happening to Sue. And I was really struck and shaken by what I saw as a kind of physical similarity. I think up until that time, I've been talking about this grandmother in the sea, and I had a notion of grannies and old ladies. And when I saw this woman so young, and then realized how young she'd been when she went into the sea, I think I'd had to revise the kind of image that I'd got since finding out in the first place about my granny. This wasn't a granny. This was a young woman. Okay, so next slide, please, Sophie. Now, some big questions arise for Sue as she thinks about her parents and interacts with her parents. Les, as I say, had died from an illness, but Avril is getting stranger and stranger as she gets older. And the questions that get generated here is, although Les never talked about his mother and never ever talked about his mother, Avril maybe has carried that trauma for Les in some ways. She was uncomfortable with it not being voiced and talked about. So we ask the question here in the story, has Avril carried this trauma for Les and at a terrible cost to herself? Can people carry somebody else's trauma? Does Sue need to escape from continuing this pattern in her own life? Are there things that are going down the generations, not just a kind of depressive makeup, but actually does it also influence the kind of relationships that she makes in her life, her friendships and her marriage to Giles? And if she does need to escape from this pattern and not repeat it, how can she do that? So these questions occupy a later part of the book. I'll now just read final bit about Letitia. This is Letitia now grown up with her own children, and she's got 2 children, and she's pregnant with a third, and we're halfway through World War One, and we're in Dorset. She's living in a place like Weymouth. It's never named as such, but it is pretty much. I wanted to keep it slightly fictional. And her husband, William, is a fisherman, and he's working on the dock. And Letitia has taken the children down to see something that's happening on the dock. So this is from chapter 9. 2 small children, and now a war. Chaos ripping through a continent. Letitia and William stood on the dockside with their young family as the crane lowered the huge, heavy weapon onto the deck of the fishing boat. Letitia held the baby tightly wrapped against the chill March air. The tiny patch of contact between their 2 faces seemed as cold as the grey gunmetal that jerked and revolved this way and that as it was lowered down before them on a rope. Huh, wait till they get near that thing with their U-boats, said William. Big surprise they'll have then, picking on an innocent fishing boat. The girl, no older than 4, watched the manoeuvre without speaking. She gripped Letitia's coat, the thumb of her other hand in her mouth. Don't say it like that, said Letitia, as if you're enjoying it. Letty, it's them or us. Soft arts and kind words ain't going to win this war. We shouldn't have brought the children. It's not a thing for them to see. Mary looked up at her father and then towards her mother. Is Daddy going to shoot that gun? Do you see? Her imagination's already running riot. I'm going to take them home. The long, tapering barrel of the gun slid round towards them in its lazy orbit, and Mary clung more tightly to the hands of her mother, crouching and turning away as the eye of the barrel settled its regard directly on her. She gave an alarmed cry and pressed her face into her mother's coat. Don't worry, Mary, we're going back home. This isn't a nice place to be. I want to stay. I want to watch Daddy, said Mary. But they don't. Letitia takes them home, and they're walking along the seafront on their way home. Letitia had felt increasingly unsettled in recent days, unsteady in her opinions, as if every perspective was blocked, walled in by sandbags. She pushed Douglas in his perambulator along the esplanade, wanting to be home before the wet mist turned to heavier rain in the freshening breeze. But Mary could only walk so fast, and today she was even slower, her attention diverted by activity down on the beach. Men had driven stakes into the sand, crisscrossed like wickerwork, and were tentatively unrolling coils of barbed wire and attempting to string it between the posts. Like terrible Christmas decorations, thought Letitia, out of season, on a windy beach, spiked and cruel. She was reassured, heartened even at times, by the thought of some murderous invader impaled and captured before he could break through with his rifle and bayonet into streets where children played and neighbours went about their business. But she also struggled with sensitivities that she deemed unworthy, traitorous even. There were times when the metal pricked her own flesh, began to tear her as if she made the slightest attempt to escape. The hot, deep pain of the enemy, the increasing intensity of the incisions as he became more entangled in his struggling, became her own, as severe and as terrifying as any real wounds. She feared her own screams would no longer be containable, that they would burst from her into the world. It was unforgivable. Okay, that's the end of the sections I'm going to read. As I say, going back to the chapters, they do build up, and Sue and Letitia come closer together in space on the page as the book comes to the end. It's all rather serious, everything I've read, and there are not a lot of laughs in this book, but I will say that there is some resolution at the end, and although it's not a riotously happy ending, there is, if you've come with the book through that, there is some resolution, and some of these issues become resolved for some of the characters. I think I might leave it there. Next slide, please, Seth. We're left with that kind of thought, and that really is something which pervades the book. I've actually caught up my time, which had a slightly slow start. We're going to finish at 8:30. What I'd like to do, with your indulgence, is go on for another 10 minutes and just have some questions. But if you've timed in for 7:30 to 8:30, then please do feel free to leave if you want to at 8:30. But I was going to see whether people have got any questions, and I suggest we do that through the chat function. I think some of you know, well, some of you do know about this, and some of you are already on it. If you don't know chat, well, Sophie, you're there. Will people be seeing the screen that you're seeing? And can you explain where it is, please?
So at the moment, I'm showing the slides. If you want, I can end the slides and it just be on you. And then the chat's there. It should be at the bottom of everyone's screens, depending on what device you've joined on. If you move the mouse or tap on the screen, you should see a function saying chat. And I'll type in it now. So hopefully you should get a pop-up if you'd like to type anything back for questions.
Is the chat under something called More, usually?
Sometimes if you've not got all the icons, it either says chat or it says more, and then you can click more and then chat. Okay. But I've just put a thing, so hopefully there should be a little 1 or a number flashing.
Okay, so if you've got any questions, you want to pop them up. If there are a lot of questions, I may not be able to answer them all. We can end the slideshow then, thanks. So, and if there aren't any questions, I'll have to get my ukulele out for the last 10 minutes. And you don't want that. So, have we got any? Right, do I need to open the chat? Yes, I probably do. Okay, so people saying nice things. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to end the so if I didn't want to end the slideshow, there's one more slide. So in terms of, yes, the point of the the point of the launch is to try and encourage people to acquire this book. Somebody's just asked me that. If you do want the book, and obviously I'm trying to encourage interest in it, but I don't like to hard sell. But if you do want the book, it's available from that link with Amazon, and it's available in paperback or a Kindle version. And I think you possibly can click on that link directly. It will take you through to Amazon. And I'll maybe leave this up when we finish talking at the end. You can also email me at that email there, and I can do a bank transfer arrangement and mail you a copy, or if it's local, I can hand deliver it by Cheery Cycle Courier. And then there are some local bookshops in Derbyshire, these 3, that stock copies, so it's available there. Can I just say, I mean, I've got a number of writer friends who are on this link tonight, also musicians and people who are visual artists who are all making things, CDs, paintings or whatever, cards, books. It is incredibly encouraging to people who do this work. If you do get hold of their work and you like it, if you could let them know and or write reviews somewhere on social media, or actually word of mouth. Word of mouth is incredibly helpful to people who otherwise, are trying to get their works noticed in a massive world out there. So, yes, I think word of mouth is incredible. And I'd ask you, if you did get this book and you liked it, if you could mention to others, that would be great. But could you do that for any books, please? And I'm trying to do that more. I'm trying to write reviews of things I've read and things I've listened to, just to help make other people aware. So there's the availability. And if I go back to the chat now, are there any questions? Otherwise, it is the ukulele. It's not really. All right. Magdalene says, do you believe people can carry fears or unresolved issues for each other? Hello, Magdalene. I don't know you. I think you might be over there in Colorado, are you? Do I think people can carry them? Yes, I think they can. Yes, I think they can. Oh, you're in London. Hello. I see, the short answer is yes. The long answer I'd have to think about and probably enter into another hour's lecture or so. I don't think it's just one directly carries fears. I think that perhaps biologically one inherits a bit of one's parents' temperament, which makes you kind of more robust or less robust, those sorts of things. Then also you witness and see things in terms of how people very close to you behave, especially when you're young. So I think you can pick up a propensity towards those things, not directly. Yeah, so that's my Sue and Ian. Where are we? Where are we? All right. Sue Hogben, hello, Sue, down in Weymouth. Did you set the path of the story out first, or did the characters lead you? That's a good question. I had a rough idea where I was going, but actually the writing of the story took me in other places. And I didn't have the ending until I'd been with this book for quite a long time. And then the ending suddenly began falling into place at the end. I had already written a totally different book, and I hacked out a good half of it and rewrote half. So it used to end in a very different way. But I had a rough idea where I was going, but then I didn't know how it was going to end. And you keep hearing these things about writers saying, I can't wait to get writing this morning to see where my characters are going to take me. And I've heard that sort of stuff over the years. I thought, I don't think it's like that for me. But actually, I suppose in a way, this story did take me where it was going to go. Sue and Ian, will you be doing a book signing? Thank you. Wirksworth Heritage Centre has said that they will have me in there on Tuesday week. So that's market day. Tuesday week, I'll be sitting there at a little lonely table. And should anyone pass by, I'll sign a book. Yes. Have I got any? Thank you. Some nice comments up there. Thank you. Have I missed any? Was it cathartic to write the book, Shirley Mann? Was it cathartic to write the book? I don't know. It was cathartic to go through the process that I personally went through, which later fed into the book. I think that's certainly true. I mean, I did quite long sessions of therapy, really to sort my own thoughts and feelings out about my family's particular circumstances. And that therapy was certainly cathartic and useful and helped me grow. And I'm afraid it does find its way into the book with dear old Sue in the later chapters, but it does her some good as well, really. Thank you. Nice chapters. That nice. Okay. Well, great. I think we've got the questions. All right. Phil Stringer, my old mate Phil. Hello, Phil, in Hampshire. I'm about 2/3 of the way through and haven't spotted any references to Dylan as yet. What am I missing? There will be none. There are none. This is one thing I've written where there are none. I'm finally free. Sue Hogben. How dare you, Phil Stringer? Sue Hogben. There might be a book event later in the year in Weymouth. Would you be interested in going along? Sue, that sounds great. If we could combine that with a trip and a bit of a holiday down that way, definitely. Yes. Yes. Got something here which says send to Suzanne. I don't know what to do with that. Okay. We'll keep you updated. Okay, Sue, that's great. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we may be there. Lynn Hanford, did you ever get in from Colorado? If you're there. Tom and Mia in Los Angeles, did you appear? Megan, hello Megan, from my reading group, and somebody who helped me greatly in the early stages when I was writing for publication. Megan Taylor's a well-published novelist. I'm going to say young novelist. You are a young novelist from Nottingham. Is there anything you miss about being immersed in writing a novel? What are you writing next? Is there anything I miss about being immersed in a novel? Well, I do miss those waking up at 3 a.m.s and then not being able to get back to sleep because I'm starting thinking about the character here. But I don't miss it an awful lot. Well, yes and no, really. When the writing's going well, there's nothing better and I'm walking on air. When it's not going well, I do wonder why I'm doing it, and it just creates great lethargy. So it was very nice to get to this stage. I am very pleased with the final product after a long journey. What are you writing next? I'm not writing anything, Megan, at the moment. I have no idea what I'm going to write next, when or where, but we'll just see, really. Things keep popping up. I'm quite happy reading at the moment and cycling. Claire, to everybody, what do you prefer writing, fact or fiction? Well, that's a good question. Is that Claire Lawrence? I haven't written much fiction. I mean, I was an academic and wrote lots and lots with some of you. Oh, Claire Pointer. Hi, Claire. Claire's in my reading group. I spent 20 or 30 years writing non-fiction, academic stuff. And then I started writing poetry and memoir and stuff and articles that were basically, about climbing or stuff that I'd done. So none of that was fiction. Really, this book has been my first foray into fiction. Yeah, it is actually. The more I think about it, all autobiography, as we said at the beginning with P.D. James, is partly fictional. So yes, I don't know what I prefer. Claire, it depends what day you ask me, I think. Oh, Jenny, thank you. This is the link for the book. Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I don't know how many people couldn't get in the end, and I'm really sorry if I messed up some of the technology. Yeah, I'm really sorry. Well, I'm getting on a bit, I mean, I'm having a go, me and technology, people of our age, etc., etc. But I'm really, really sorry if I've missed. Let's finish the slides, Soph, and I'd just like to see who's around. Oh gosh, you're all still there. Hello. Well, I think I've finished. Gosh, all these people. Gosh, hello. Some of you I hadn't seen at the beginning. I'm sorry if some of you had a delay getting in. Thank you for, I hope it's been worthwhile. Thank you for staying with me. And I think we'll conclude now, unless there's any really burning questions. I don't want to drag it on beyond its natural lifetime. Okay, I'll just have a look in the chat and see if there's any questions. Okay, well, thank you, people, for those nice comments you made. And yeah, thank you very much. I've been looking forward to doing this, but I must admit, in the last couple of days, I thought I'll be glad to get started. Not glad to get it over with, but just glad to get started. I didn't like having to kind of prepare for the unknown, really. And despite all the preparation, we had to wing it at the beginning. Thank you for sticking with me. And I can see people waving. I'm going to say goodbye. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much. It really has meant a lot to me. Thank you. Bye-bye.